Okay, so we are beginning Unit 6, and it's all about reverse engineering. We've been talking about identifying an object to use for this process. There are multiple steps in doing the reverse engineering, and the first is to do a visual analysis, where we're going to analyze the object we're using visually, and we're going to use the criteria, like the elements and principles of design, in this PowerPoint to do this visual analysis. So I want to talk about the elements first. Then we'll talk about the principles. We use elements to create the principles design, and I'll show you some examples of that. And then we'll talk about the first activity that we're going to do. So let's start with the elements then. There are 8 integral components used in the creation of design, and they are point, line, color, value, shape, form, space, and texture. Now, we're not going to find an object that encompasses all 8 of these, but we would expect to find some of them that are very obvious about that object. Okay? So let's start by talking about point. The point is going to be the most basic of elements, has position but no dimension, and can be described by coordinates on a plane. So if we think about the way that we sketch in Inventor, we use points for the placement of holes. We use points to mark the corners for, let's say, rectangles and stuff like that in the way that we sketch, and it is shown on a coordinate system. So most designed objects aren't necessarily going to show points as a key feature, but it does exist. It's something that you should be aware of. Line is going to be the next one. It has only length dimension and can be used to either define a boundary, indicate volume, create perspective and depth, create textures and patterns, and suggest movement. And there's 4 types of lines that we see in design, and they are vertical, horizontal, diagonal, and curved. And I have some images that have basically examples of each of these. Starting with vertical then. A vertical line is characterized by dignity, formality, stability, and strength. And if I look at these examples in images, like the Empire State Building, if I were to describe the types of lines that were used in the design of this building, I would say probably vertical lines. It's the first one that stands out to me. Same with the skyscraper in the last example. In contrast, if I look at these images here, I would say the use of horizontal lines would be more of the element that stands out in the design. In fact, this building reminds me of the Darden building that's across the street. They use a lot of horizontal lines as a key feature of design for that building. Diagonal lines, as you'd expect, lines that are at a diagonal, and then curved lines. And probably the most famous example for that is going to be the Sydney Opera House, the use of curves as a key feature of that design. The next element is going to be color, and color can be broken down or described in 3 ways. The hue is the base color. So you can say, well, this object is red, or this object is blue. There's the value, which is the lightness or darkness, like it's a light blue, it's a dark blue. And then there's saturation, which is the purity or intensity relative to a gray. So 3 ways to describe the color of the object. You can also describe colors by temperature, right? So it's a cool color versus a warm color. The warm colors are your reds, your oranges, your yellows. The cool colors are the blues, the purples, and the greens. Color has an immediate impact and profound effect on the design of the object. In this case, they're using green as the color to describe this electrical vehicle because we think green as far as being good for the environment and stuff like that. So they use that as a key element of design in that object. Now, value can relate to color, but it's not exactly the same thing. And the image here may not be the best way to describe it, but it's the relative lightness or darkness of color, object, or shape. So it does include color, but it's not grouped with color. It's its own element. The best way to think about value is the way that we use it, what we call it tonal shading. If I want to make a 2-dimensional object look more 3D, I add value, or I have dark tones and light tones that I add to the object to make things look more 3D or make things stand out more. So that would be value. A shape is a 2D area enclosed by lines or curves. We did a lot of calculations in Unit 5 about like the area of these shapes. And these shapes can be broken down into different categories. Geometric, like square, circle, and triangle. Mechanical, so like gears, simple machines. and organic, something that's natural or simulating something that occurs in nature. So if I'm describing a two-dimensional object, I'm using shape as the element. Some examples of that. Form is the 3D version of the same thing. So if I'm describing a geometric form, it's going to be a three-dimensional object, or in this case, a mechanical, or something that's maybe organic. Okay. So if I look at this example, Oriental Pearl Tower, there's a definite use of forms, like in this case, like a sphere, as a key element of the design of that building. Space is a little tricky one to show an example of. It's defined as areas between and around parts of an image, apply depth in that image, and so you have positive and negative space. The positive would be the actual physical object in that space. The negative is kind of the remainder, everything that's not part of that object. So you have positive space and negative space. You can also think about space as a way of describing whether something is open or cluttered. So if you think of like the layout of this classroom, is the design open or is it very cluttered and congested in the way that the space works within the room? So these examples are a little bit tough, and you may or may not find these in your elements, but this does exist as an element. And then the last element is texture. It has to do with the surface look or feel. We have two types: smooth, which is going to reflect more light, appear to be more intense in color, and we have rough, which absorbs more light and appears to be darker. So I can describe an element by its texture. Here we have the exterior facade of the Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles, very smooth, as compared to this very rough texture here. So those are the 8 elements. I don't know what fluffy is, but it's those are the 8 elements of design. And when we start the reverse engineering project, a lot of these are going to be evident in the object that you've selected. We'll talk about that. The second part of this is the principles of design. And although they appear to be talking about some of the same things, they are slightly different. The principles of design typically use the elements to create these principles. So let's say I want to create contrast. I could use texture to do that. I could have one object be in a very rough texture as compared to another object that's smooth. Or if I want to create emphasis, I could use color to do that. You have something that's very like warm colors versus something that's cool colors. So we're going to use the elements to create these principles. Okay. So let's work through these. Some of the examples in this are not amazing, so hopefully my explanation will be a little bit clearer than some of the images that we have in here. So let's talk about balance. Visual and physical balance of an object is basically the distribution of elements within that design. And the types that we see are symmetrical, asymmetrical, and radial balance. Symmetrical is very obvious to identify. Basically, the elements within the design are identical in visual weight in relation to a center line or an axis. I use the Taj Mahal as an example, and I place an axis directly through the center. Everything I see on the one side is mirrored on the other side. So this is formal or symmetrical balance in the design. Asymmetrical or informal balance, in this case, the elements within the design are not identical, but are arranged to provide balanced visual weight. So again, I put the axis in the middle. The two sides are not exactly the same thing, but as far as visual weight, they're about the same. So that's described as having asymmetrical balance. And then finally, radial balance. Radial comes, I get the term radius, I think circles automatically. And basically, it's the distribution of components in a circular pattern around a center point. The next principle is emphasis. And the idea is to draw attention to one area or a focal point. And this can be achieved through size, placement, shape, contrast, use of lines. Notice that some of these, like shape, use of lines, color, these are elements. So I can create emphasis like, this focal point for this interior space. Maybe the texture out here is rough compared to smooth texture here. Differences in the color here and here. I'm using vertical lines, just maybe pointing towards that focal point. So there's a lot of elements I can use to create this specific principle. This one seems pretty obvious to me. They're using color for emphasis. And this is how to unlock the seatbelt. It's important. I've made it in red versus everything else that's in black. Contrast is the degree of relative difference between elements. So let's use this example here. This object has vertical lines as a design feature. Right? Its color, its texture is very different from the one down here. So I've created contrast between the two, again, using elements to do that. It can be used to emphasize an element of design. In this case, I'm selling, or the manufacturer of this car, I'm emphasizing, the people, the placement within this vehicle. I've done that by using color versus, minimum of color, no color at all, to create the emphasis, contrast. The next principle is rhythm, and it's going to be the repeated use of line, shape, color, texture, or pattern. These are all elements. And the types of rhythm that we see are regular, random, gradated, and graduated. These two appear to be very, very similar. And so we're going to try to distinguish between the two and look at a few examples. The examples aren't necessarily the best, but we'll talk about the differences. Regular rhythm is probably the easiest one to identify. It's repeated element, same repetition, same interval. I'm using the same tile over and over again, and each tile exactly the same distance apart. So it has a regular rhythm. As compared to the repetition of elements in random or irregular intervals, right? So on St. Basil's Cathedral in Russia, they have the same three-dimensional form that gets repeated as the design. But the placement of this form is not at a certain interval. It changes the distance from each other and stuff like that. And so this is a random rhythm. Here's the first of the two that get a little bit confusing. Gradated is the repeated element is identical, so I'm repeating the same element and stays the same except for one aspect of that, and in this case it's going to be increasing or decreasing in, let's say, size, right? So the same element, but it's getting either smaller or larger, so that's considered gradated rhythm. As compared to graduated rhythm, the element itself doesn't change size, it's the same element, but the placement, meaning how close they are to each other or how far apart they are from each other, changes. So that is going to be graduated, and that's the difference between the previous example. Element stays the same size, it's the clustering or the placement of the element that either gets closer or farther apart. A couple more. Proportion is the comparative relationship between the elements in a design with respect to size, and the scale then is the proportion or size of an element in relation to the other elements here. And they're showing the mall in Washington, D.C. as an example of proportion scale between some of the very famous monuments. Obviously, these are not right next to each other. If you've been there before, there's quite a bit of distance in between, but they're showing the scale in this image. Unity is the consistent use of design elements. So I'm using consistent colors, consistent shapes, consistent forms in a design. And then finally, the last one, economy, which is the use of the bare minimum of elements. This can be achieved by removing elements that aren't necessarily needed, and it's the concept of, in simplicity, there's beauty, or less is more. So if you find an object and you find it difficult to find many elements within that object, maybe the design principle is to be economy, right? So scale back, very simple in design. Okay. This matrix, which we won't use for today's activity, is used to help identify and basically document the elements and principles of design which we see in an object. I want to come back to this when we start our actual visual analysis. So we're going to skip over this for today. We'll jump into today's actual activity. So we're starting 6.1. Download this from the LMS. And in this activity, our goal is to identify the design principles and elements in objects. We're not going to do whatever your reverse engineering object is yet. We're going to practice in this activity and then apply that to your object. It does say to use note cards. It would be my preference to do this on a Word document instead. Okay, so we don't need to use note cards for this. We'll do it directly on a Word document. And your goal is to identify a household type item or something that you have on you or something you've researched online, and identify in that item the elements and principles of design that are very apparent or that you can justify an answer for. So this, as an example, let's say is a soap dish. I would start by adding an image in. So if we're doing this on a Word document, and I found this image online, place it in my Word document, and then identify the elements that are obvious in that image. So they're saying bright red and green colors. So they see color as an element. Curved and straight lines, rectangular and circular shapes, geometric forms, and a smooth texture. So those are the elements that are obvious. Then identify the principles in that same object. So they've created emphasis by the use of red color against green background. They're using straight lines versus curved lines to create contrast. There's formal balance, like if I place an axis through the center, it's identical on both sides. So whatever it is that you find evident in there with regards to the elements and principles, I want you to document in that Word document. We're going to do this process for 5 items. So you pick the 5 items that you want to do it on. When you're done, make sure that you answer the conclusion questions that are at the bottom. So there's 4 of them, and then you can submit that to the LMS. I'm going to give you 2 days to do this. So we'll do this today and tomorrow. On Monday, when we get back from the weekend, we'll go through the same process. We'll use the matrix that I showed you at the end of the PowerPoint, and then apply it to the object that you're using for reverse engineering.